With the Penguins off on Thursday, Pat and I are going to look at the farm a little bit and look at how Wilkes-Barre is doing this season. Plus, if anyone could be getting a call up here at some point pretty soon, that's all coming up right after this.
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes. You can follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodes, joined by my co-host, Patrick Damp. You can follow him on Twitter at Synonym for Wet, and you can follow the show's Twitter at LO_Penguins. Of course, thank you all so much for making this your first listen/watch of the day. We are free and available on all platforms. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, Pat, I love the Western Canada trip. You know that. Everyone that listens to the show knows that as well. But man, the only thing I don't like about it is how late in the day, East Coast time, the Penguins practice, because they're not scheduled to practice for another hour and 15 minutes. We're recording this at 3:15 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, and we don't want to be waiting for practice overall, considering that most of the lines are probably going to be similar. So we wanted to start off today's show by focusing on Wilkes-Barre and how the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins off to a good start this season. They've won 3 in a row. They're 3-1 overall this season. Philip Larson is playing really well in net. Sergei Murashov has also had a really good start. And you look at the top point producers for this team, Pat, it's our good friend, Sam Poulin. He already has 1 goal, 6 points in 4 games. You also have Emil Bemstrom, who was on the Penguins for a good chunk of last season. He has 2 goals, 5 points in 4 games. You also have Ville Koivunen. He's a point per game player. Jimmy Huntington, he's a point per game player as well. Rutger McGroarty, he's only been there for a couple of games. No points so far, but he's still kind of getting acclimated a little bit. I don't think it's going to last too much longer. I think he's going to be really turning it on here, at some point pretty soon. But you're seeing players doing what they need to do to potentially earn a call up a bit later this season. For example, someone like Sam Poulin, who I know we've both been a little bit tough on, but we've just been wanting him to show what he can do at the NHL level, but he just hasn't been able to do that at camp and in the preseason. And that's led him to being down in Wilkes-Barre for quite a while now. But I will say it is good that he's off to this start.
It is. And this is exactly what you want to see from a player like Sam Poulin. You want to see him dominate that level and get off to a good start, especially because I think they're like a lot of players that we've spoken about in Poulin's position. There's a little bit of a crisis of confidence with them. They have this first round pedigree. They're expected to make a difference. It doesn't happen right away. And it can affect their game when they get to the NHL level and they don't produce as expected. But then you send him down to the AHL, and he's still very much young enough that there could be some runway. Now it's rapidly decreasing. He's running out of chances and running out of time. But if he continues to produce in Wilkes-Barre, it's definitely worth giving him at least another shot later on down the road in the season. And it's been a good start for Wilkes-Barre overall. They dropped their first game to the Charlotte Checkers 7-6, and then they win 3 straight. They beat the Thunderbirds 4-1. Then they get back-to-back wins against the Lehigh Valley Phantoms 4-3 and 3-0 respectively. And you're seeing a lot of good from this team. And again, we always want to stress this, especially with AHL games and AHL teams. You're not looking so much for the outcome of the game. Now, you do want them playing important hockey. You do want them being a competitive team because that helps build your culture as an organization. If you're playing meaningful hockey in the American League and you're held to that standard, it'll be a lot easier to go up to the NHL and play to that same standard. But you also want to see the players you've got your eye on playing well. We talked about Poulin. Obviously, Bemstrom is a little bit different. That guy's had NHL experience, but it's another player you want to see go down to the AHL and play very well because he shouldn't be at that level. But then, like you said, Koivunen's a guy who we have high hopes for. Getting 4 assists in 4 games is very encouraging. Avery Hayes has 2 goals, which is huge. That's another young guy that we would like to see turn into something. And the same thing goes for Tristan Brose having 2 goals in 4 games. These are players that in the next 1, 2, 3 years, you want to be with the Pittsburgh Penguins and making a difference. And they're off to a very encouraging start.
Right. I'm really excited for Koivunen just because when I look back at that Gensel trade, like, yes, obviously, Bunting performed really well at the end of last season. He still hasn't found his level yet this season, though I'm hope it's coming. But in terms of the prospects that came back, I was really excited about Koivunen because I feel like he has a higher ceiling, at least to me, over Ponomarev. And he's already off to a great start, even though he doesn't have too much experience playing North American hockey. This is like his first full season in North America, and the fact that he's already off to this good of a start is encouraging. And you said it for Tristan Brose, he has 2 goals in 4 games. I don't know if you're going to see him with the Penguins at all this season unless a whole bunch of injuries come up, but I do think definitely next season that could be a time where he really starts pushing for the main roster, where you get out some of these veterans, especially if the team is not that good at the deadline, you make some trades. But I definitely think next season is when he's going to start really pushing, at least for some time at the NHL level. Maybe not someone that's going to play in the top 6, but maybe someone on the 3rd or 4th line. And also the same for Koivunen as well, especially with the start that he's had too. You mentioned Avery Hayes. Owen Pickering, he has no points in 4 games so far, though I don't expect that to last too much longer. Again, this is his first full professional season. So again, he's getting used to some things. He had a really good camp, really good preseason. If there's some injuries to the defense for the Penguins, I definitely think he's going to be one of the first players that comes up from Wilkes-Barre, as well as Sebastian Aho, who does have 3 points in 4 games. I think Aho, I don't think he's an everyday player at the NHL level, but I also don't think he belongs in the AHL full-time, in my opinion. Kind of similar to Benstrom. I don't think those are full-time NHLers. I think they're just kind of tweeners at the NHL level overall. But those are some of the other things I've been noticing as well for Wilkes-Barre to start this season.
For sure. And keeping that going, another good sign that we're seeing, something we have gushed about on this show, is the goaltending depth in the organization. Obviously, we know Yoel Blomqvist is with the big club right now with everything going on with Tristan Jarry, but the other 2 guys who are playing right now in Wilkes-Barre through these first few games are having some solid performances. Sergei Murashov has 1 game. He gets the win. He only gives up 1 goal, makes 27 saves on 28 shots. He's got a .964, which is a very solid starting save percentage. And Philip Larson has played in 2 games. He's got a 1-1 record, but a .911 save percentage. He's off to a very good start himself. Handful of goals against for him, but in 2 games, a .911 save percentage with this team off to as good of a start as it is. We know that this team's future in net is hopefully going to be very bright, and this is a good start by them. Again, obviously, we want to stress very small sample size here. The season has only just begun for Wilkes-Barre, only 4 games, but a lot of very encouraging signs from the guys down on the farm to start the year.
Right. And I do think if Blomqvist stays up for the Penguins for a good chunk of this season, if not the entire season, you're going to see Larson start the majority of the games in Wilkes-Barre, and then they'll have a decision to make. Do they want to have Murashov be his backup, or do they want to have Murashov start most of the games in Wheeling? Because remember, Wheeling season is starting at the beginning of November. So Kyle Dubas and Jason Spezza, then they'll have some decisions to make overall when it comes to, Murashov. Will he be the backup, or will he start in the ECHL? But that's still, again, a very good problem to have if you're the Penguins as a whole. But I think that will do it for this first segment. Coming up in the second segment, yes, my friends, Jaromir Jagr, still very much a legend. There was a great piece in The Athletic today going into Jagr's farewell tour overseas, and it was a delight to read. Pat and I are going to discuss that coming up here in the second segment. But before we get to that, we got to tell you all about our first sponsor, and that is FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. All right, we're back here in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes, joined by my co-host, Patrick Dam. So, Pat, this piece on Jagr by Matthew Fairburn in The Athletic was amazing to read. It just goes into, again, his farewell tour, how everyone in the hockey world loves him. And the money quote from that article, I sent it to you. It's, he doesn't think he's better than anyone. He treats everyone the same, no matter what. And just seeing how his teammates speak about him, seeing how, the front office speak about him, obviously seeing how the Penguins speak about him, anyone in the hockey community has positive things to say about him. And obviously it sucks that this is coming to an end for his playing career, even though he's still so old at this point, but he has such a swagger about him, even though he is old at this point. And reading that article, I had the biggest smile on my face. Obviously, they were talking about Jagr's jersey retirement with the Penguins, but then, coming back, playing a little bit last season, and then this season, it was a delight to read.
It was really awesome, and we're not going to read this whole thing to you. If you have an Athletic subscription, this is worth every single word and every single penny. Matthew Fairburn knocked this out of the park. It's a great kind of day in the life piece and a little bit of reporting on the players over in Kladno that Jagr plays with. And it kind of gets into just the whole, as they say in the headline, there's this aura around him as both a third liner. Let's not get that lost. He is on Kladno's third line, and owner, and basically a de facto general manager, because a bunch of guys that are quoted in the piece talk about how their agents reach out to them and they don't say, "Oh, Kladno wants to sign you." It's Jagr wants to sign you. And it's so great. And he talked to one player, and I'm going to botch his name, so I apologize, but it's Edwards Chalmax, I believe is how you say it. And he gives these incredible quotes about Jagr. And there was one that he had that was just, it sums up Jaromir Jagr perfectly. And I'll read this one verbatim. Like I said, I'm not going to read the whole article, but I'll read this quote verbatim. He says, "A lot of people, it's not like they're done because they don't like hockey anymore. They just want to live a normal life. For him, normal life is this." And if that doesn't sum up Jaromir Jagr, because everywhere he went, including his early days in Pittsburgh to his journeyman era at the end of his time in the NHL, every player to a man was like, "Oh, I'd come in early. He'd be working out. We'd be done with practice. He'd be on the ice, an hour after practice finished, just doing whatever." And there were also stories from Philadelphia and New Jersey and other places that he played where he would get the keys from like the rink attendant and just be there late night training. So this is just continued in Kladno, but it has so much more meaning because this isn't a great team in the Czech league. They're a very fringe team that they have faced relegation multiple times over the past decade. And because of his work ethic, because of his aura, being able to sign players, he's been able to keep that team in the top Czech league. So this is just a really fun story. And the legend of Jaromir Jagr just continues to grow by the day.
My favorite story from that article was that Jagr apparently told his teammates he wanted to play in every exhibition game, but he only played in one because he tore his hamstring and he needed like 6 weeks without skating. And then the quote was, "You think he took those 4 to 6 weeks? 3 days later, he was already skating on the ice by himself. And then in 2 to 3 weeks, he was already on the ice with them and he wasn't taking that advice at all." That is Jaromir Jagr to a T. He's like, "You know what? I don't care. Screw that. Hockey is in my bones every single day. I'm not abiding by that 6 weeks. I'm skating basically right away." And when I read that, I literally just laughed out loud because that sums up Jagr to a T. And I am really, really hoping that he gets to do some scouting for the Penguins or that they hire him to be some sort of advisor for the organization, because I really feel like he would knock it out of the park, especially with how much hockey knowledge he possesses.
For sure. And this feature digs into it of how he kind of appeals to players in Kladno. And it's not him just resting on his laurels and being like, hey, I'm Jaromir Jagr. I'm a living legend. I own this team. You should come play for it. It's not him making that hard, I know who I am pitch. It's that he's still one of the guys. And he doesn't, like I said, he doesn't make that hard pitch. He's not out there negotiating contracts. All of these players that were spoken to for the article basically said he calls us and just talks hockey. He doesn't try to make the hard sell or appeal to the agents or anything. He's just like, oh yeah, like, I'll tell you stories about hockey. I'll tell you about how I train. I'll tell you what I think you do well. I'll tell you what I think I can do better. And if you translate that to one day possibly working for the Penguins organization, that's an asset in and of itself, because guys are going to want to talk to Jaromir Jagr. He's a legend. He's one of the 5, if not 3 best players to ever play the sport, but he doesn't have this arrogance. He doesn't have this mystique about him. Yeah, he's got the legend. He's got the aura, and your phone rings and it says Jaromir Jagr, you're going to pick it up. But the fact that he's just like, oh yeah, when I was playing in the 90s, this was a guaranteed goal. Or, when I was going from city to city and I had to learn how to train and all this stuff, all of a sudden, and one of the players in that story says it, where he's like, I have to pinch myself that I'm just having a hockey conversation with Jaromir Jagr and I can consider him one of my friends. So if you can translate that to him being a scout, to him being some sort of ambassador for the organization, that's going to give you a leg up over so many other organizations, because there's not a million Jaromir Jagrs. There's one of them, one of one. And if he has that ability as a scout or an ambassador, you're going to get some diamonds in the rough out of Europe from Jaromir Jagr.
And I know that the article mentions this, but I don't think he'd have to sell his team over there and also be working for the Penguins. I think there can be a reality where he owns the team and he also is an ambassador or an advisor for the Penguins, and maybe he can work remotely. And sometimes he can come to Pittsburgh for some select events or for some select games. But I think there's a reality where he can do both. He doesn't have to sell the team and also work for the Penguins. I think he can work for the team while also owning his team in Kladno overseas.
And there's also, the article also mentions this, and I agree with what you're saying. I don't think there's a world where he sells it. No. You can tell that as much, and we saw this last year with all the celebrations of Jaromir Jagr, how much Pittsburgh means to him, how much the Penguins mean to him. But you can tell that this Kladno team, it's deeply personal. He's deeply passionate about this team, that city, and keeping that team above water. But they mentioned that there's other players from that area that could maybe be like an ownership group along with him, and that's Tomas Plekanec and Jakub Voracek. And yeah, do they have the same clout as Jaromir Jagr? Not even close. But if you're a Czech team or a European team, and you're owned by a group of players, including Jaromir Jagr and guys who had very successful NHL careers, that gives you a similar leg up. It's not just some corporation over in Europe that owns the team and you don't know them. It's a bunch of guys who carved out successful NHL careers. So there's definitely a world where he can do both.
Right. No, I agree. And it's kind of like that. I forget what exactly the meme is, but it's like both. Yeah, both. Yeah, both is good. So hopefully there can be one day where he does some work for the Penguins organization while also still owning the team in Kladno. But that'll do it for this second segment. Coming up to end the show, we're going to dive into some news and notes around the league, including Justin Schultz signing in Switzerland, Connor Sherry being waived, and Connor McDavid saying that Sidney Crosby should captain Team Canada at the Four Nations faceoff, and I'm sure at the Olympics as well. But before we get to that, we have to tell you all about our second sponsor, and that is Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't even have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. They have Game Time Picks. Creation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and so much more. There's also all-in pricing, toggling Downloading this feature shows the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. There's also seat views. Get a full view from your seat in the app before you buy, and they have the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. And we're not done. We still got to tell you about our last sponsor, and that is Prize Picks. It's the best way to get real money sports action. And with over 10 million members and billions of dollars in award winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. It's also the best way to get action on sports in over 30 states, including California, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. It's also the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy, so your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. And if your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, PrizePicks still keeps your lineup going. You can sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive a $50 bonus. It's guaranteed to you. PrizePicks also offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday. Each Tuesday, PrizePicks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value for your lineups. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. One more time, download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. All right, we're back here in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes, joined by my co-host, Patrick Dam. So, Pat, digging into some news and notes around the league, some Penguin-specific notes, we should say, starting with Justin Schultz signing in Switzerland on Wednesday, basically ending his NHL career as a whole. And I had such a treat watching him, especially in 2016 and 17. And while I obviously will always love the Chris Kunitz goal, it'll be forever ingrained in my memory and in obviously Penguins history, there's a small part of me that wishes Justin Schultz had that game winner in the third period, just with the way he celebrated, the way that he played throughout that entire cup run. It was magical, especially with Chris Letang out for that entire playoff run. Schultz really stepped up, was the Penguins' #1 defenseman. That is the best hockey I think he has played during his career. And even in 16 as well, no one really thought much of him after the Penguins got him at the trade deadline. Everyone was kind of making fun of Jim Rutherford for it. And then he goes out there and is great on the third pairing. And then he very much earned those minutes in 17. And he played pretty well, I felt like, for a couple seasons after that. He obviously went a bit downhill towards the very end of his Penguins tenure. But when he was in his prime with this team, he was an absolute treat to watch, and I'll never forget seeing him absolutely hammered at the parade, the Schultz chug, obviously, and then, of course, him and Oli Mata chugging beers on the bus. And I'll always remember Oli Mata being passed out on the balcony, I think, of his apartment or one of the teammates' apartments. They were just gone that entire day. But Schultz, if that's the end of your NHL career, congratulations. It was one heck of a time, and he was awesome in 16 and 17 for this team.
It really doesn't get talked about or appreciated enough that Schultz's trade to the Penguins kind of revitalized his career.
Yeah.
Because he had sky high expectations coming into the league with the Oilers, and he just did not meet them. And this wasn't really a case of, say, Jesse Puljujarvi, who we've talked about a lot, where it was just not the right pick for that slot in the draft. He earned getting picked as high as he did and just did not live up to that expectation. And is because I remember, I believe it was a Spectre tweet after the trade where it said, he was like, oh, they're not getting a defenseman, they're getting Justin Schultz, in a very condescending tone. But as soon as he got here, they rebuilt him, essentially. Like you said, starts on the third pairing when he gets to the club from the 15-16 season to the 16-17 season, works his way up the defensive depth chart. And they went defense by committee in the 2017 playoffs. And he was your de facto number one, but he put up a hell of an effort in that 2017 Cup run. And he's one of the people, maybe not high up on the list, but definitely on the list of, if they don't have that guy in 2017, they don't win the Stanley Cup.
Absolutely not. They do not, especially with the way he played throughout that regular season and in the playoffs too. And speaking of other former Penguins, Connor Sherry was also placed on waivers on Wednesday. He cleared waivers on Thursday, but it was unfortunate to see because as recently as a couple of years ago, he was still performing really well. Those last two seasons in Washington, 21-22 and then 22-23, he had 34 combined goals. In the 21-22 season, he had 19 goals, 43 points in 71 games. The season after that, he had 15 goals, 37 points in 82 games. But these last couple of years in Tampa Bay, just not really much of anything. In 60 games, 4 goals, 15 points throughout that time. And I tweeted yesterday that it was kind of a fall from grace. I got a little bit of flack for that, which I understand just because I feel like no one really expected him to do this well in the NHL, considering, his size and everything about his game. And I do think they make solid points because he's had a really solid career up until this point. I mean, again, Pat, you look at his numbers, almost 600 games, 591 to be exact, 124 goals, 267 points, really solid numbers as a whole. And I really hope that this isn't the end for him as for being a competent player in the league, because he's had some really sound seasons as a depth contributor for multiple teams.
He carved out a solid little career after the Penguins as a depth player. And what I'm about to say may sound insulting, and I don't mean it to be that way, but he is what everybody thought Jake Gensel was. He was very good with Sidney Crosby, but he was absolutely elevated by Sidney Crosby. And once he no longer had Crosby as a center, his game, as expected, decreased, but in no world was he a bad player. It wasn't like Crosby was filling in for all of his flaws. It was just they had great chemistry together and he helped him elevate his game. But away from 87, he was, as you said, basically just a depth player who could pop you a few points and a few goals here and there. And I think part of the reason it hasn't worked out as well for him elsewhere is that he was getting put into roles to be a top 6 contributor, and that just wasn't his game. Very solid depth forward, very solid career. Would love to see him bounce back with Tampa Bay or somewhere else. But at the end of the day, his ceiling was depth contributor, and he played that role extremely well away from the Penguins.
I always loved seeing the line of Gensel, Crosby, Sherry, just because, it was Sid and his kids at the time. And it was, again, a joy to watch when all three of them were performing well. And one more former Penguin to discuss for this segment before we get to the McDavid quote. That is Chad Ruhwedel, former Penguins defenseman. Chad Ruhwedel was put on waivers today by the New York Rangers. And I hate seeing that for him just because he's always been a very solid number 6, number 7 defenseman, but I think the Rangers just really don't have the room for him right now. I've been seeing takes on social media about, should the Penguins claim him? I think right now, probably not, just because of the way that Jackson Ivany is playing, and they also have Ryan Shea. I think if you claim Ruhwedel, you're kind of just, I don't want to say rearranging deck chairs, because I don't think that's what it is, but you're just adding another number 6, number 7 defenseman for the sake of adding it. And I just don't think that's going to be too much of a difference over someone like St. Ivany or Ryan Shea. And I also want to see St. Ivany get more minutes because I continue to be high on him as a player.
I'm right there with you. And you've already got 48 contracts on the books, and you don't have a ton of cap space right now. So as much as I would like to see a solid defenseman like Ruhwedel get a chance, it just isn't going to be here.
Right. And last thing to end the show here, Connor McDavid was asked about who will be the captain for the Four Nations face-off, and he had a very quick answer. He said, should be Sid for sure. That's not even a question. So yes, Connor, thank you for that answer. I think everyone knows that Sidney Crosby should be the captain of Team Canada, not only for the Four Nations face-off, but also for the Olympics in 2026 as well. He is a great ambassador for the sport, not just in North America, but all around the world. If you're not naming him captain for both those tournaments, what are we doing here? And it also was funny earlier this week. I was seeing this discourse around Tom Wilson for Team Canada. And while I understand Tom Wilson is a very good player, one of the top power forwards in the league, should he be on Team Canada? No. Sorry. I mean, I can think of at least 12 forwards who are better than him right now. But are they going to put him on there? Oh, you bet. That's going to happen, people.
But it was, to the McDavid quote, it was funny because the question actually was, it doesn't matter who the captain is. And McDavid didn't even hesitate. It was just, yeah, it should be Crosby. And he went on to say, he's Sidney Crosby. He's been there so many times. He's the guy, but it's not like I haven't thought about it. But it's just such a no-brainer. It should be Sid. And I think that's both correct in the sense that, yeah, it should be Sidney Crosby because he is still Sidney Crosby. But you figure the Four Nations face off and then the 26 Olympics, I believe, that's going to be the swan song for Sidney Crosby. Probably. That's going to be, other than whatever other Four Nations face off or World Cup of Hockey that they put on between now and 2030, that's you'll see Sid in those tournaments, but I would be genuinely stunned if Crosby was still at it in 2030. And even if he was, it's crazy to say he would be a fourth liner on that Canada team if he plays all the way to 2030.
I mean, with how much depth Canada has right now and how much depth Canada will have down the line, as you said, in 2030, it's probably the case, though. Again, that's no disrespect to Crosby with how great he's been throughout his career, but I think
that said, though, before we close out, I got to take one last quick shot, Hunter. Is somebody who'd be depth on Canada, would that be Austin Matthews?
You know what? That's just not even funny. That's just ugly, Pat. That's what it is. That's, again, for those that were not listening to the show at that point, I legitimately once said that Austin Matthews was going to be on Team Canada. And that is probably the dumbest thing I have ever said in the history of the show. And I started the show 5 years ago. So, Pat, you know what? Thank you for that reminder. And you might be fired after this episode now.
But no, I couldn't help myself, man. I'm sorry.
I know. We're just messing around. But no, Austin Matthews will very much be on Team USA and will be their top center for that team. And I'm excited for Team USA because this is the best roster this country has had in a very long time, at least in my lifetime. That's for sure. I'm excited for that tournament coming up here in a few months, but I think that will do it for today's episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to / watch this one. Pat and I will be back with another show for you all on Friday to get you all set for Pens Oilers and Penguins Canucks. I can't wait for both games. The Penguins really need to win at least one of those games heading back to Pittsburgh for a nice homestand, including against Marc-Andre Fleury and the Minnesota Wild. We'll preview that game coming up next week. But again, for Patrick Damp, I'm Hunter Hodes. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll be back on Friday for a couple of previews.